Hey everybody, it's your friend and your guy and your favorite creator who gets inexplicably excited about ththings, Gardener. If you've followed me or the channel for any length of time, then you'll know that I fancy myself somewhat of a controller nerd. I mean, on my desk I have just a litany of controllers. I love controllers. I think that they're super fun. I collect them, and I'm working on a project where I'm going to be actually building like a little controller display, like a Hall of Fame, my favorite controllers. That's a little ways down the line, but regardless, I was sitting here appreciating my controllers and I realized that they don't get enough attention. I don't talk about my controller collection nearly enough. So having said that, here are my top 5 favorite controllers for PC. So let's be clear about something. The Xbox 360 controller is the de facto gamepad for PC. It's a solid controller with great support across the board, even for games that you really shouldn't be playing with a controller on PC. It's great in that lowest common denominator kind of way. It has 4 face buttons, analog and responsive triggers, perfectly clicky bumpers, a grouping of function buttons including back, home, and start, and concave thumbsticks. It also has this killer accessory, the chat pad. And the chat pad works with Linux through the user space Xbox DRV driver. But the 360 controller, for all its positives, really is lacking in a few crucial areas. For example, the ergonomics of this device are surpassed by every other controller on this list. And maybe I've just been unlucky, but every gamepad that I've bought after the initial run of the 360 controllers, the thumbsticks just had huge issues with thumbstick sensitivity and dead zones. To use the 360 controller on PC, you either need a wired controller, which is its own SKU for some reason, or you need a wireless dongle to connect the gamepad's proprietary 2.4 GHz signal to your PC. And more bad news, this controller is over a decade old now, which is bananas to me. Its age sets it apart from every other controller on this list, missing like features that I consider absolute must-haves for PC gaming in 2021. But all of that is nothing compared to its most egregious sin. The Xbox 360 controller, everyone harps on it, the D-pad. This mushy, awkwardly placed disc-shaped abomination resigns you to playing platformers with an analog stick, and anyone who does that is damned to hell for eternity. Look, the 360 controller was designed with shooters in mind. And not just shooters, but really Halo. And this controller is actually pretty good at what it's designed for. But you might be saying to yourself, shooters on a gamepad? And look, I mean, on PC, you have much better choices when it comes to playing shooters with a gamepad. And really, shooters aren't the games that I prefer to play on PC anyway. For PC gaming, I think the 360 controller is best laid out for like third-person shooters or racing games or something like that. But again, for things like that, there's still better controllers on this list than the 360 controller, and it's on this list because it is the lowest common denominator. It is the controller that has the most broad support, and it's what every game eventually targets. Number 4 is the Steam controller. The Steam controller is rad. It is awesome, it's amazing, and it also quickly becomes incomprehensible. That's its biggest flaw, really. Physically, this device fits well into my large-ish hands, right? And Valve dared to upend the status quo when it came to the Steam controller, eschewing the familiar dual thumbstick and face button combo for 2 large trackpads, a single thumbstick, and awkwardly placed face buttons. But that's not all. The bumpers and analog triggers are complemented by secondary stage digital triggers and grip buttons on the rear. But the controller really shines and also falls flat due to the software. Very few titles actually support this gamepad natively, and Valve knew that would be the case, so they integrated customization features right into Steam that allow you to not only perfectly tailor your inputs to your favorite games, but also confuse the hell out of yourself and everyone else who dares to download your configuration. And yeah, the face buttons are pretty awkwardly placed, but they're also good enough as is because truthfully, these face buttons aren't as important on this controller because you have all the other controls at your fingertips. The thumbstick is also a bit of a stretch for my hands, and that is kind of a pain point for me. And its convex top also kind of leads to my finger slipping off a lot. I'm tempted to say that this would be a better design, but then everyone would know that I secretly prefer to play shooter games with the Steam controller, and we can't have that. But the trackpads, oh man, these trackpads are better than... They feel amazing, and they allow you to have coarse camera control with the flick of a finger, and you're afforded finer adjustments with more conscious and precise movements. They also have haptic feedback, which gives you the impression that they're rolling like a trackball, and that's super convenient as well. But the most eye-opening feature, at least for me, with the Steam controller, was something that Valve included as almost an afterthought and the community discovered on their own. And that's motion controls. Now, I know a lot of people are going to hear motion controls and again throw their keyboard through their screen, but hear me out. The software allows you to only activate gyro aiming when you have rested your thumb on the trackpad, and this gives you the level of acuity on a gamepad that approaches the accuracy of a mouse. And this is important because if you're going to be playing a shooter with a gamepad and you're not using gyro controls, then you're better off just not playing a shooter at all. The problem is, few games actually natively support the Steam controller. So when you've mapped out an X input A button press to the right grip on the controller, the game doesn't know that and just kind of shows you an A button prompt. And for all your big gamer brain, until you've fully inculcated yourself in this new control scheme, you might as well be making a prayer to an unknowable elder god. Keep in mind that if you're familiar with emulation and you're used to playing SNES games with a DualShock, this is quite different. At least on a DualShock, there's a one-to-one mapping and your muscle memory can just kind of take over there. But here, well, you can map whatever functionality you want to whatever button, and the game is none the wiser. And neither are you. And there's so much potential here for mapping. I mean, you can set the left stick to emulate a left analog stick on the movement stick on an Xbox controller. And then the right trackpad you can set to be mouse input. But in many instances, games get confused when they're receiving both gamepad input and mouse input, and just kind of lock one out when the other one is happening. Or even more obnoxiously, the game will basically switch button prompts on screen as you're playing with a split down the middle Steam controller. So you either have to configure the analog stick to work like key presses on your keyboard and the right trackpad to work like a mouse, and then deal with the game presenting you keyboard inputs as prompts, which in no way correspond with what is displayed here or what you have available to you on the controller. Or you can use the right trackpad as an analog stick and lose all of the benefit of actually having a trackpad at your fingertips. The Steam controller is also wireless. It supports 2.4 gigahertz via a proprietary dongle, but this one is less egregious, or you can also use Bluetooth with this device. Now, if more could be done through software to increase compatibility with games and to lower the bar of entry for new controller configurations, and perhaps if the Steam controller were actually still in production, the Steam controller would be #1 on my list. And even for certain game types, like any game that isn't designed for a gamepad, in that 10-foot experience it's going to be #1 on my list. I'd rather be sitting on my sofa using a Steam controller playing City Skylines than using a mouse and keyboard on my sofa. That just doesn't make sense to me. And it is also #1 in my book for shooters. I really actually do prefer playing shooters on a Steam controller. That's as long as it actually enables you to play the game with analog movement inputs and a mouse input for the camera. But for most of the games that I actually prefer playing, which is platformers, there are many better options out there, and that's kind of why I decided to make this list in the first place. So let's talk about controllers that actually don't suck for that purpose. Number 3, the DualSense. All right, so here we have the Sony PlayStation DualSense. This is the PlayStation 5 controller, and it's cool, and its functionality is constantly evolving as Valve and the Linux kernel team develop software that actually supports this interesting piece of tech. And this controller really is interesting. I mean, in many ways, it feels and functions identical to its older brother, the DualShock 4. It has 4 well-sized face buttons, 3 function buttons, bumpers, analog triggers, 2 thumbsticks, a great D-pad, and a large and clickable trackpad. And the left side of this controller lends itself well to platformers, since using a D-pad is the only right way to play a side-scroller. It also has motion control and audio capabilities, and the motion control here is excellent. But it differs from its predecessor with a built-in microphone, adaptive triggers which aren't really supported on PC yet, and HD rumble, which is kind of weird right now as the HD rumble feature actually exposes itself as a frickin' audio device on my computer. And I've plugged in this device and you can't see it and you can't hear it, but it's vibrating to the theme song of the channel here. And if I touch the microphone, you can actually hear the vibration. And what's really crazy is that you can actually touch it to your head and hear the music. It's like bone conduction. And it's crazy. It really works if you put it like right up to your ear canal. It's amazing. All right, anyway. One of the other nice things about this device is that it actually interfaces with your PC either via Bluetooth or the thankfully USB Type-C port on the top of this device. But all this extra technology also means that they had to cut corners in other places. Cut corner. The D-pad feels like it has slightly more travel than the DualShock 4, which makes it slightly less responsive. It also has looser build tolerances, at least in this initial run. And the face buttons really just don't feel as nice here to play with than the DualShock 4. I mean, they don't have as satisfying a click when you press them. That's nice. The ergonomics of the DualSense are great. It feels amazing to just hold in the hand. I really love how this feels, except for where your thumbs rest naturally. And at least for me, that's how it is. It's slightly less optimum. When you have to contort your hands to reach the circle and the left button on the D-pad, it's not a good time. You end up cramping your hands. So okay, I've compared the DualSense to the DualShock 4, and in a lot of ways, it's been mostly unfavorable comparisons. But don't let that fool you. I mean, I really do love the DualSense, and these are all kind of nitpicky issues. But the fact is, between the trackpad, the available gyro aiming, the good D-pad, the USB-C port, I think that this is one of my favorite controllers of all time, and it stands on its own as a fantastic piece of gaming engineering. Number 2, the Switch Pro controller. Now this is the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. This pad is awesome. It's got Xbox style thumbstick placement, which is good for shooters, and it's my preferred style for shooters. 4 large and responsive face buttons, an extra function button, 4 digital shoulder buttons, and a surprisingly only okay D-pad. The Switch Pro also offers motion control here, so you can enable gyro aim using Steam's controller configuration. This is a critical feature in my opinion, but choosing when gyro aim actually is activated is especially difficult on the Switch Pro controller and on the DualShock and DualSense controllers. The Switch Pro controller, though, really only has digital trigger buttons, and that's kind of a pain. Ideally, you only want to activate gyro aiming when you need precision aiming, so like secondary fire, or having to pull the iron sights up to shoot, or a game like Grand Theft Auto where you're aiming over the shoulder. That's when you want gyro aim to be enabled, and at no other time. Other games don't lend themselves well to gyro aim, and when it comes to these kind of controllers, gyro aim is actually emulating a joystick, and that's not quite the most ideal way to do it. The gamepad connects to your PC via Bluetooth, or it can also connect via a USB Type-C port, which is really the only option. I mean, there's no other good option out there. And I want to complain about this D-pad for a minute. It's better than the 360's D-pad, but it feels a little stiff, a little unresponsive. And you know what? I thought Nintendo knew how to make a D-pad. I don't know what happened here. You were supposed to be the chosen one! Overall though, the Switch Pro controller is a fantastic option if you don't need digital triggers. And really the digital triggers and the D-pad are the only things that keep this from being my #1 favorite. All right, so we've arrived at #1, and #1 is the Microsoft Sidewinder Gamepad. This actually uses the game controller port on your sound card, and I'm just kidding, it's not this controller. #1 is the DualShock 4. You probably saw it coming if you know my channel. Okay, so we talked about the PlayStation 5 controller, and honestly, not a lot changed between generations, but every little nitpick that I had with the DualSense really had to do with comparing that device directly to this one, the DualShock 4. It is an immensely satisfying device to use. The face buttons just feel so good. Excellent analog sticks, best-in-class D-pad, 3 function buttons, analog triggers, well-placed bumpers, motion controls, and a clickable trackpad. It also has audio capabilities that I've literally never used. It connects to your PC via Bluetooth or, micro USB? Sorry, pardon me. It also has a god-awful light bar that illuminates everything in your living room up to 100 meters away. Besides the use of micro USB and the hideous light bar, which you can thankfully control with Steam input, the DualShock 4 really is, I believe, the best gamepad for PC, bar none. It has the best thumbsticks with the best placement, the best ergonomics, and simply goes toe-to-toe with the lowest common denominator, while also having the best implementation of required features for 2021. Namely gyros, its D-pad, and the touchpad, which the trackpad is actually really good for the 10-foot experience when you're sitting on the sofa and you just want to play a PC game. Plus, you can actually customize the functionality of the trackpad in Steam input to do any number of things in-game. And if I hadn't actually laid my hands on a DualSense, I would tell you that I think that the ergonomics here are perfect. The grips feel great, it feels perfect in the hand. If I'm gonna play a shooter or a strategy game on PC, I'm probably gonna use a Steam controller. But if I'm playing literally any other type of PC game, it's going to be the DualShock 4. That means that for me, the analog stick placement, it doesn't matter here. I don't use analog sticks that often when I play most types of games. The grips are shaped well for my hands and leave my fingers, and more specifically my thumbs, where I can actually reach every control comfortably. And you know what? Many games also detect the DualShock 4 when it's connected and display button prompts accordingly. And this really isn't a feature of the gamepad itself, but it is really just one of those icing on the cake things that makes playing with a DualShock controller just one of the best experiences on PC. Okay, so you might be wondering, why didn't I include the Xbox One or Xbox Series X controllers on this list? I want to give a special shout out to my patrons, without whom I would not be able to do this. You guys have made it possible for me to be able to bring on some people to help me make these amazing videos. I have a lot of fun making this one. There's a couple photos up on my Instagram of us having fun fooling around making this video. If you like this video and you're not supporting the show on Patreon and you want to help the show, that's the best way to do it. Support the show on Patreon. You can become a channel member here as well. But yeah, I want to know what your favorite controllers are for PC. Let me know down in the comments. I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to say about this one. This might be one of the most divisive videos I've ever made. Don't forget to hit that like button, that share button, and that subscribe button to stay up to date with all the cool stuff that I'm doing here on the channel. But I think that's going to do it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a blessed day.